Hi, I'm Delaney Davies, and today I'll be cooking scrambled eggs and testing the difference between heavy whipping cream, 2% milk, and water, and how that will affect the taste and the texture of the scrambled eggs. Overall, I think that the heavy whipping cream will result in a very nice, creamy, and smoother texture and taste. The water will have a airy and a fluffy puffed up texture, and the 2% milk will have a hardened and chewy texture due to proteins in the milk. So I started off with making my water and egg mixture. To do this, I added 3 eggs of varying sizes. I kept the egg sizes similar between each set. And then I added 1.5 tablespoons of liquid per each round. Now, in the reading, it talks about when adding liquid, it says 1.5 to 2 tablespoons per egg. I didn't really read the per egg part or didn't take notice of it until later on when I was filming this after I was editing the video. And this will just make my experiment turn out less noticeable, but it won't necessarily change the outcome because I kept it the same from all three different liquids. This is kind of what the overall look of it looked like, and looks like just regular eggs because the water is clear and therefore doesn't really change the color of the eggs. Up next was the cooking process. I chose to go with a low heat and stirring constantly. My heat was at about 3.5, and this is supposed to result in a moist small curd, and this is what I did see overall. Additionally, you can kind of see steam rising off the eggs as I'm cooking that, and that steam is actually just from the water evaporating and is what is adding kind of that airy texture to my eggs. The cook time, I would also say, is very similar and typical of just what you would expect when you're cooking your scrambled eggs at home. And then speaking of the cooking process, somewhat what we're seeing when we're cooking eggs is the denaturing of proteins in the eggs and the coagulation of those denatured proteins. So what I mean by that is eggs are naturally in a coiled or spring-like shape, and when you add heat to them, they straighten out and form what you would call a denatured protein. And then when those denatured proteins interact with other denatured proteins, you result in a three-dimensional shape, and this three-dimensional mesh shape, and that is what forms your scrambled eggs or your solid eggs. So after I was done with that cook time, I set them off to the side and started on my 2% milk mixture. So here you can kind of see me tapping the eggs on the side of my counter. In the reading, I did notice that you were supposed to, one way you could test for freshness of the egg was tapping it on a flat surface, and that would also help keep eggshells out of it. However, in the moment, I naturally just went for my instinct of tapping on the edge of a surface and didn't really notice that I had done that until I was editing my video later on. So again, I added the 1.5 tablespoons of milk, and specifically with the milk, we kind of see a difference in the proteins. So the water only was adding steam to the elements and it didn't add any fat or protein, but the milk ended up actually adding protein. And some people believe that this interaction of the milk proteins and the interaction of the egg proteins make the egg texture harder because those proteins are being denatured and then interacting with each other, is kind of the thought process there. Also, in that part of it, I was beating my eggs together. I did this before, and I was beating the eggs together just using a regular fork, and that was so I could get them all nice and mixed together evenly. And again, on my color, I didn't really notice a big difference. I didn't get the whole cooking time recorded, but it overall was just a very similar to the water cooking time. And I noticed, and then this is kind of where you see that intermediate stage of like some of the eggs have started to denature and then coagulate together. So you can kind of see all of that interaction. And then I was ready to do, put this off to the side, and I was ready to do my heavy whipping cream. So again, I went through the process of adding all of that and then beating it together with the fork to mix it in. And what the heavy whipping cream is kind of doing differently is it's changing the fat content. So heavy whipping cream actually doesn't have any protein content, so it's not affecting the proteins. However, it does have a very high fat content. I think it has 5 grams of fat per 1 tablespoon. So this is definitely increasing your thing and will affect the overall texture. In the book, it talks about adding the heavy whipping cream at the very end when the eggs are almost done cooking. I decided against doing that for my video and then instead beating it in with the eggs like I had, just to keep a similar kind of experiment throughout, so that my only real variable was the overall what liquid I was adding. Here you can see, you can't really see it in the video, but in person the egg color was significantly lighter and different from the previous 2 eggs. One other thing I want to point out about the cooking process of this was that I thought these eggs actually took a little bit longer to cook, and I would attribute that probably to the fat content. I'm guessing the fat content kind of made it liquidier, because that fat doesn't necessarily evaporate the same way that water would, and it doesn't coagulate the same way that the proteins would. So it was a little liquider and took a little longer. I wouldn't say it was like a crazy amount of time or wasn't a like excessive amount of extra time, but it definitely was something that I noticed while I was doing it. One other thing I want to point out here was that in order to keep some of my variables at a constant across all of my 3 different testing states, was I used the exact same pan. I would scrape it out in between to get as much, so there might be like some interaction of the eggs, but not enough to really affect it here. And I also would take the pan off the burner for just a little bit in between me finishing cooking one and then me being ready to cook the next. And I did this to kind of control the heat of the temperature of the pan. So before, I heated it up so that it was already warm, well, like it would be for the following 2 experiments. And this was kind of the same concept of taking it off for a little bit to like lower the temperature back down and then putting it back on, so that the heat of the pan stayed at a very constant texture and constant temperature, so that wasn't a huge variable affecting my thing. Wasn't a huge variable affecting my overall outcome of the eggs. Again, I would say that this just felt like it took a long time, and I in fact kind of left the original video in just to kind of showcase that as the extended time period. But after that was done, I set it aside and I let it cool down a little bit so that the heat wasn't something that was affecting my overall taste. And even after the eggs were done cooking, I still noticed that they were, like, a little more, I still noticed that they were, like, a little more, not necessarily liquidy, but had a different texture than the other two. So that first pan that I originally pointed to was the water, and then that last plate I pointed to was the, and I'm showing it there, is the heavy whipping cream, and then that middle one is the milk. You can't really see the difference on camera, but the heavy whipping cream is a lighter texture and smaller curds, and the other two are very similar in very similar in color. So I started off by trying my water eggs, and I didn't necessarily taste a huge difference. I did think that they were fluffy and that they did have a nice texture. I also noticed that these curds were a little bigger compared to necessarily, say, the curds in the milk, and I attribute this to kind of the fluffiness of it. It puffed them up a little bit. Next up, I tried the milk protein ones, and as far as taste go, I would say neither of these had a different taste, but they did have different textures. This texture I noticed was a chewier texture, or at least I noticed it was a chewier texture than the other one. I went back and tested it because it was slight differences in my opinion, but I did think it had a chewier texture. And then on my heavy whipping cream, which I'm getting ready to try in a minute, I thought they were very creamy. And I honestly, these were my favorite. And when I asked my family to try them, my mom agreed that that was her favorite. In fact, I had them kind of do a blind taste testing, and overall, my mom guessed that the heavy whipping cream one's right, but ended up switching the last two, and I attribute that somewhat to me not having as much liquid in content, so the variations weren't as noticeable. Thank you.